Hi, welcome. My name is Lynette, and this is All Things Development. Today, we're going to be looking at Rwanda, and we are going to be looking at the past and what's happened in Rwanda. Today, we know Rwanda as one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, a place which is has clean roads, no plastic bags, little corruption, aid well utilized, ICT technology way ahead of other African countries, a peaceful country. But was it always like this? And what what happened about 25, 26 years ago? Now, apart from the way Rwanda has grown and is a model, a poster country for Africa, we all know that the reason why this garners so much international attention is because Rwanda faced one of the most horrific genocides in world history. And what caused this genocide that led to about 800,000 people killed by people they knew, their neighbors, husbands, friends? What could have caused this kind of situation? For us to decode and to understand what happened in Rwanda, we have to go a few centuries back, actually, whereby we'll go back to the 15th century in Rwanda. So, Rwanda has two major tribes, which is the Hutu and the Tutsis. We have the Twa that are pygmies, but they're a minority, and in the 15th century, we find that, in fact, let me just make it clear that the tribes were not differentiated by language. Usually, tribes have different language, but in Rwanda, it was not so. It's actually a homogeneous society, something similar to Somali, where they speak one language, they have the same religion, but we can see that there are differences. The differences in Somalia, the clans. In Rwanda, it was actually economic status. So there were two major tribes, the Tutsis and the Hutus. The Hutus, being the majority, were mostly cattle. No, they were actually farmers, and they tilled the land. Um, the Tutsis were mostly cattle herders, and the physical appearance was that the Tutsis were a bit taller. People would say that they came from Ethiopia. They were of Nilotic origin. We are not sure. And the Hutus were more, coming from West Africa, Central Africa, and such like. But they were the same in terms of language, culture, dance. Everything was the same except the economic status. And another difference was that the Tutsis were put in charge. So in the 15th century, there was Hutu council, and this council would elect a Tutsi leader who would lead the population, and this worked. But in the 18th century, the Tutsi kings decided, wait a minute, we don't even need this Hutu council to elect us. We are going to decide, the fate of everyone. And it was more like serfdom, whereby the Hutus were like slaves to the Tutsi kings, and there was quite a lot of resentment accumulated during that period. And actually, one of the things that development people deal with is trying to curb inequality. Inequality leads to a lot of things. You can have a country that is, let's say, mineral rich, but you have such a huge margin between the poor people and the rich people that will always, always, always cause tension, political divides, worst case scenario wars. So that happened, but somehow they were still able to live in peace until now. The scramble of Africa, where Germans came and said, we are taking over your country and we are not going to change anything. We see that this serfdom, the Tutsi kings being the leaders in the society, they were happy with that arrangement because, first of all, they thought that the Tutsis, because they were tall and had features of like narrow noses and some Nilotic features. They thought that maybe the origins of these people are Mediterranean, and Mediterranean people, some of them come from Europe. So they were like, yeah, you are the leaders. We are differentiating you according to the way you look. When German handed over Rwanda after the First World War, it went to the Belgians, and Belgians now cemented this difference. We had Belgian priests coming to measure the noses of Rwandese people to differentiate them, their eyes, the the height of the people, just to differentiate between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Prior to that, we know that it was an economic difference there, and it was what can I say? It was fluid. The movement between these two tribes was fluid in the sense of, if I could acquire enough wealth as a Hutu, I could become a Tutsi, and if a Tutsi lost their cattle in disease or war, then they automatically became a Hutu. So it was not set in stone. It was just what it was. But now the Belgians in 1932 issued identity cards to differentiate between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Not only that, they gave the Tutsis more power. They gave them, administration powers, governmental power. So that meant the Tutsis became more um, more stronger in this society. They became richer, and the Hutus were like slaves in that society. So that resentment was simmering, you know. And now, after the scramble of Africa, Belgians had stayed in Rwanda for a while, and we come to early 1960s when most African countries were getting independence. Now, the Belgians knew that it was time to hand over, and they realized that they had been unfair to the Hutus. They were even the majority that are like, we need to right this wrong. And they decided to hand over the country to the Hutus. And you remember that the Hutu had already underlying resentment of the way they had been treated, of course, by the Belgians, but had also resentment towards the Tutsi, who had oppressed them for so many years, up to centuries. And they felt like, now we get a chance to say, our ancestors, our grandparents never got this opportunity. We've now taken over government. So there were fights, and a lot of Tutsis were actually displaced and chased out of the country. They were killed in 1959, and many of them fled. Some went to Burundi, others Tanzania, others Uganda, others landed in Congo. Now, at this time, Paul Kagame was 2 years old. He was a Tutsi, he was from a Tutsi family, and they fled to Uganda. As he was growing up, he actually wondered, why they were living in refugee camps, and he was told his country's history. So when he grew up, there were some Tutsis in the refugee camps that joined Yoweri Museveni in the resistance against Idi Amin and later Milton Obote. And Paul Kagame and Rigema were one of these young men. There was already the Rwanda Patriotic Front that was, pushing for the refugees in Uganda to go back home, and actually refugees from all over to go back home. And they wanted to go back to their country, of course. So what happened is Yoweri ousted Idi Amin, and he had a party called it wasn't a party, it was a popular resistance army that was able to fight Idi Amin, and later on Milton Obote, after he won elections in 1980. So when Yoweri Museveni won this election, when he actually ousted Milton Obote, the the army consisted of a mixture of Ugandans and Rwandese, and Paul Kagame and Rigemba were given top positions in his military because they were really good at what they did. Now, during the day, they were fighting the Ugandan war, but in the evenings and in other free times, they would, come together and strategize of how they will take over Rwanda, how they will go back and take over Rwanda. So these were the same people. Of course, The president at the time, President Habyarimana, was not amused by this, told Yoweri Museveni, you need to get rid of those Rwandese who are in your government, and you've given them senior positions. They are threatening my authority here. And he did. He actually um, disposed them, and but they were still senior officials in the government. They just were not the heads of the military of Uganda, because that gave them a lot of power. So what happened now? In 1990, Paul Kagame decided to go to the US to pursue some military training, but his friend, who was the former Minister of Defense, Fred Rwigema, decided to go back to Rwanda with 4,000 troops of the um, RPF and take over his country. It wasn't well planned out, because when they did go, within 1 or 2 days of entering Rwandan borders, he was killed, you know. And also within that time, they lost like 2,000 soldiers. So the president Habyarimana had, knew about this attack, and his army was quite well trained. By that time, Habyarimana had known that the RPF was threatening his country, so he had really used a lot of the country's money to buy military armor and military um, things, I mean, ammunition and things like that, so that they could be weaponized. So when the RPF came through, they were completely, beaten. And when Kagame heard about this, he stopped the training, came back, and joined the RPF in Rwanda, just to try to salvage the situation. So they waged guerrilla warfare. The good thing with the RPF, they were well trained, because many of them trained in the Ugandan army, and they were militarized because they got military support from the Ugandan government at the time. You remember that they had fought and helped Yoweri Museveni get power, so they had his support for sure. Um, so anyway, meanwhile in Rwanda, first of all, there were two things happening. The majority Hutu, the normal Hutus, were not really impressed by their president, because he had formed a clique of people around, a clique of very rich Hutu around him, and the rest of the country was just languishing in poverty. You've heard that he had used a lot of money to buy military equipment and things like that. So there was no money for healthcare. There was nothing. People were disgruntled. And then because of this, now when the RPF entered Rwanda, the president took advantage of this and said, like diverted the attention from the problem already his government had, and started, saying that the Tutsis had come to kill the Hutus. So there were two things that happened at that time. In 1990, there was a newspaper called Kangura, and this translated to Wake Up. It was a newspaper published by extremist Hutus, who would say that, you should not trust the Tutsis. The Tutsis are trying to take over. It was hate speech. And we can actually, Rwanda shows us how much media contributes to the political stability of a country. Media has the potential of actually making countries go to war. And later on, after President Kagame took over, there was quite some limitations in the media freedom in Rwanda. And to be honest, it's understandable, because after you've been through such genocide, you don't want to give people freedom. So at that time, before the genocide, there was complete freedom. Like, it was ridiculous, because after that in 1993, this propaganda spread through radio. So most of the Rwandese people did not have televisions, but every household had a radio. So there was a channel, I mean, there was a radio station called RTLM, and it played really catchy music. So it was really popular with the youth and majority of the country. It played catchy music from Congo and the world over. But around midnight, around, I don't know, some odd hours, in between the songs, you'd hear kill the cockroaches, cut down the trees, really evil, yeah, evil like messages that were pitting the Hutus against the Tutsis. It was almost like indoctrination, whereby, or it wasn't even subliminal, it was obvious that, actually, even they would have a list of, we want this number 1 to 10 Tutsis killed. At some point they would stop the music and say, these are the Tutsis that should be killed. And sometimes you'd find the Tutsis had to buy had to buy their freedom away. They had to, like, ask to pay so that their names could be removed on the list. So already, the those tools were used by the Hutu extremists to try to curtail the RPF that was coming through. The international community did not like this. And, because of already RPF had already entered the mountainous area of Rwanda, and they were taking over that side. So they were making considerable, progress in their guerrilla warfare. The international community pressured Habyarimana to sign a peace accord so that they could have peace. Whereby now, instead of just giving the Hutus all the jobs, they would include the Tutsis. Tutsis would be in the government, they'll be given also jobs, And because Habyarimana was trying to, keep the people together, he decided to go. I mean, that's made sense to actually just, like, peacefully end this. However, already the Hutu had already been radicalized. His wife, the president's wife, was quite radical. She and the Interahamwe were planning to exterminate these people. And RPF were also thinking that, okay, yes, we are here in Arusha trying to make a peace accord, but we want our country back. The aim of forming the army was not just to have, half or a quarter of the power in the country. It was to take over, was to get back the Tutsis that had been displaced. They were coming back to take over. They were not coming back for a peace accord. But anyway, the Arusha Peace Accord happened in 1993. It was signed in August 1993, and Habyarimana thought that it was okay, but no, it was not. The RPF continued fighting. The Hutu extremists continued telling people that you need to weaponize. Now, even during this time, already you see Habyarimana's government had already bought a lot of weapons, waiting for anything, just he was ready. The RPF, on the other hand, had support from Ugandan government, president. They had support in terms of military power. In fact, at that time, a lot of aid was going to Uganda, and about 48% of the foreign aid was being used to buy arms in Uganda. Of course, some of these arms were given to the RPF for fighting. So both sides were armed. And I think the worst kind of wars is where you weaponize civilians. It happened in Somalia and it happened in Rwanda, whereby now there were, like, there were machetes bought. There were tons of machetes bought. Like, for every Hutu had machetes, and this company was a Chinese company that was given that contract. The sales they made in that period of 1 month was the same sales they would make in a normal 1 year. Can you imagine the amount of machetes? The international community knew there was something happening, because as of January 1994, the UN peacekeeper commander, General Romeo Dallaire, he had already written a letter to the UN in Washington, the Security Council, and told them, listen, it's going to be chaotic here. We need to intervene in this situation. We need to, gag the media that's spreading this hate speech and everything. And because of what had happened in the Battle of Mogadishu, 1993, the US completely did not want to get involved because already the US citizens were so annoyed that their their army had been attacked and completely humiliated in the Battle of Mogadishu, which is otherwise known as Black Hawk Down. So they had a hands-off kind of policy. The UN on the other side, they had some agreements that if there was a genocide, they needed to take action, But what they did was avoid the whole situation being called a genocide. The UN General Commander in Rwanda was saying, this is a genocide about to happen. They're like, don't call it a genocide. It's not a genocide. So it was hands off from the international community. The only thing is they did not know the severity of the situation. They did not know like a million people would be killed, but they knew that there was war coming. Machetes had been bought. Um, also the Rwandan army had been. I told you that the president had used a lot of the country's money to there was an agreement between Rwanda and Egypt. There was a trade treaty between Egypt and Rwanda that um, Egypt provided with missiles and army artillery for Rwanda that was worth like 6 million USD. You know, a French company was actually approved by a French bank. Like the French bank provided the money for the Rwandan uh, government, and that's why sometimes you may hear that the French were partly to blame for what happened in that situation. The machetes were bought by this businessman and also, of course, other Hutu rich people in the country. This man called Felicien Kabuga, who was caught recently, just a few years back in France. He financed a lot of the machetes that were coming in. So people were weaponized. Now already they knew that we're going to exterminate the cockroaches because they're coming to take our power. So, and why do you think they use such vulgar, such dehumanizing language? For that exact same reason, to dehumanize. When you call someone certain names, it's like showing them that they're not human. It's like when you do an act of aggression towards them, you don't have that remorse that this is actually a person, this is a mother, this is an uncle, it was very deliberate. That's what I'm trying to say. And sometimes when you see that media is being curtailed in certain situations, it's really not a bad thing altogether. It's only when it's restricted and um, used to the advantage of maybe dictators and things like that. Or you know what I mean. Like, how do I explain this? In such situations, it's important. Like the UN should have gagged the media at that point, but they didn't. So what catalyzed this situation? What actually, what was that? The matchbox lit the whole place on fire was in April 6th, 1994. The president of Rwanda was coming from Arusha, and he was in the same airplane as the president of Burundi, and they were coming from Arusha. Of course, the peace negotiation talks, they had completed them, and they were shot down in Rwanda. Of course, everyone was killed in the aircraft, including both presidents, the Burundian president and the Rwandese president. And that is what lit the whole place. It lit it a huge, all those months of, weaponizing were triggered completely. It set off the Rwandan genocide. That was the one act that set it off. But not to say that it was not planned, because people ask who killed the presidents, who killed the presidents. But even in an article of the Salesia's newspaper I was telling you, magazine I was telling you about, Kangura, it had said that in January that the president Habyarimana was gonna be killed. That was a fact. But also the RPF, the missiles that were used to, explode the aircraft were missiles that the RPF were using. So no one really knows who killed. We had two people who wanted to kill the president, the RPF, and the Hutu extremist. So, but either way, that was what happened. Both sides were weaponized, and the Hutus began killing the Tutsis' neighbors. It was terrible. There were Tutsis who were would flee to churches to take cover, and the Hutus would bomb those churches, and it went on. It was a massacre of 100 days. The international community came to take the peace troops out. The Belgians came to take their peace troops. They are like, we don't want to get involved. This is already too late. And, this is not our war. So they left. But the UN could have had enough peacekeepers to actually prevent at least half the number of people who died. Of course, people would die, but not to that extent. So the RPF took over Kigali after 100 days, and the killings stopped. A lot of Hutus fled the country and entered Congo. Years later, the extremists, the Interahamwe, would regroup and attempt to attack Rwanda, and the President Kagame would have to, would actually counterattack, and enter Congo so that he could try to squash this kind of groups. The only problem is that when his army would do that, civilians would die. That was something that was so bad, because the terrorists who had infiltrated the camp, so you couldn't tell who it was who. So many civilians died, and in terms of human rights, Rwanda does poorly, because any dissent from the who comes out and says that the government is oppressive, they usually do not really live that long. They do not. They are, how can I say, oppressed. But sometimes it's a balance. I can imagine it's a balance whereby the government or the president does not want to go back into that situation. After 1994, there was actually, first of all, that differentiation between Hutu and Tutsis was no longer there. There was no point of saying, this person is from, the differentiation. They were like, this is what caused the division. So let's stop with that. And there were reconciliation courts that were put in place, and neighbors asked for forgiveness. The international community had a tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzania, and they were able to prosecute some people who were involved in the genocide, but the numbers are really small. They're not that much. And then there's also the question of, also RPF had revenge killings in Rwanda. So people are of the opinion, if you're going to try the Hutu extremists, then you have to try also the some of the RPF officials or some of the RPF army who would counter attack. Once they were entering Kigali, they were killing the Hutus in a counter revenge kind of situation. But apart from that, Rwanda has been able to move past that, and they have been able, in fact, to be honest, I think it's the only African country that has gotten over civil war and even superseded other countries that have not had civil wars. It would take a leader like the current president to be able to, squash all that, and to have that cohesion so that it doesn't disintegrate to what it was before. However, in terms of democracy, Rwanda can still do much, much better, and hopefully in the future we'll see more media freedom, and we'll see more of democracy in that society. But as a country in whole, they have done really well, and they were able to get past one of the most horrific genocides. So the next vlog I'll do about Rwanda is now after. So we have learned what, what caused the tension between these two, what two tribes, what happened. And now that we know exactly what happened with the genocide, we can move past that and see how as a country they've been able to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Yeah, we need to learn also the lessons that they have taught us. I think there's in development, there's something called critical juncture. After something really drastic happens, there's a change in the way things are done. And even we see that with Japan, whereby they were able to recover from the Hiroshima bombings, and they were able to become even a UN superpower. So how does what's the difference between such a society and a country whereby it fails completely, like Somalia, whereby after the civil wars with Siad Barre happened, that the country was still, completely not together. What is the difference? But what I can say is the leadership is the difference. The leadership. You needed a strong leader, a leader who is visionary, and a leader who is able to put the past behind him, but also trying to get justice for the people, or trying to get reconciliation of the two groups. Sometimes you can't get justice because like in that case the massacre was so bad, but you can be reconciled. Yeah. So if you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, um or anything you'd like, or you like my channel, you can subscribe. And yeah, see you until the next time we talk about all things development. Yeah, see you. Bye.